Hey, everybody. I'd like to talk to you today about the Gilded Age class wars. We're going to talk about kind of the upper 10% and how they perceived life, and then the working class and how they perceived life. And since the Gilded Age kind of corresponds with or happens, intertwines with the Progressive Era, I wore my Teddy Roosevelt hat. But hey, here we go. Let's talk about the differences between these classes. Now, when we say Gilded Age, for something to be gilded, it means that there has to be some sort of golden patina with on the outside, which hides something more sinister or worse underneath it. And that's what gilded means. It looks pretty on the outside, but underneath there's all this sort of really corrupt, bad stuff going on. And the Gilded Age that's a perfect metaphor for the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age itself takes its name from a book written by Mark Twain and Charles Warner, titled "The Gilded Age," of course. And basically it doesn't talk about society so much as it talks about government and government institutions and how they're corrupt and all that sort of thing. And there's no shortage of corruption scandals. If you look at my Reconstruction video, we talk about Grant and all the Grant administration struggles with corruption and different sorts of things they're into. But therein lies the basis of the Gilded Age. Looks pretty on the outside, a lot of corruption and terrible things going on underneath. Now, in the 19th century, there was a massive industrialization of the country. And with that industrialization came a change in the way that many Americans viewed their relationship with each other and with their work. And that employee-employer relationship, which we'll get to in a minute too. Now, underneath the veneer of prosperity was a growing divide between business owners and their workers, as well as poverty and corruption. 30 years after the Civil War, America has been transformed into an economic powerhouse, but that transformation had created stark new realities in terms of the divide between wealth, standing, and opportunity for some people versus everybody else. And we're talking about the upper 10% versus pretty much everybody else. Now, signs of tension between the wealthy and the upper 10% and those that fell outside that percentage were growing by the end of the 19th century. So at this same period of time, those tensions are growing, and we need only to look at, we'll look at some big business lectures a little bit later to understand how we could have such tension. But wage workers, farmers, and the rich were alien to one another. They really didn't share the same values. They didn't have the same sort of outlook on life as each other. And the way that they did things was in stark contrast to one another. That sense of strangeness was due to several factors. Each group, for whatever reason, number one, had different material circumstances. If you're working class, you're going to have different material circumstances in terms of wealth or your ability to purchase things or move upward in society than somebody in the upper 10% who is going to have plenty of money to do whatever it is they please to do. Number two, they live starkly different lives. The rich, the upper 10%, tended to live lives where they could do kind of whatever they wanted to. They had the wealth and power to do whatever they wanted to build whatever they wanted, to have whatever they wanted. The great story of that, the great interesting thing of that is that Andrew Carnegie, who is this great guy, this rags to riches person that we really try to hone in on. He is a guy who loved to ride horses through Central Park every morning before he went to work, before he went to his office to start dealing with the steel industry and all the issues of the day. He liked to ride horses. In the 3 hours that it took him to ride through Central Park, his steel mills near Pittsburgh would crank out roughly enough steel to make him enough money in 3 hours that he would make basically what an average person during that time working in one of his factories made. In 3 hours, he would make the amount of money that a person working in one of his factories could make in an entire year. That's insane. And of course, you know, it's plenty of hours in a day. That thing runs for at least 12 hours. So he's going to have just scads of money every single day coming in. For working class families, that's not the case. It takes them an entire year to make what he makes in 3 hours. So the divide between these ultra rich and the people who are not so rich becomes larger during this period of time. And it's almost like they're being taken advantage, these working people are being taken advantage of. So there's something else there. Now, the other thing is that they tended to hold starkly different views on major issues of the day. They had different ways of looking at the major issues of the day, most of which centered around business. Your business owners, of course, are going to want to maximize profit margins, and so they're going to want to keep the mine or the mill or the factory open as long as they can. They're going to want these people to work as long as they possibly can, and they're going to generally expect them to work for very little money, and that's, you know, a problem in and of itself. Whereas the working class people, these guys employed to work in these factories, mines, and mills, are going to want lower hours. So they're gonna you know, charge forward with an 8-hour workday. They're gonna want at least a minimum wage, not paid whatever, you know, you can pay me, but at least a minimum wage, an 8-hour workday. They're going to want, you know, more in the way of health and safety in the workplace. There's literally no safety devices on most of the stuff in factories at this point in time. By 1913, the United States has one of the highest workplace fatality or injury rates in the world. So it's bad. So they want starkly different things. They expect starkly different things. And they invoke, fourth thing, they invoke different and often contradictory values to guide, explain, and justify their way of life. The person who has to worry about, you know, how to spend my money all day, how am I going to spend all this money, has a different viewpoint in life than the person who wants to be like that guy and is striving to do that. The working class person generally is going to warily eye consumption. In other words, the ability to, you know, going out and purchasing things, buying stuff because you don't have a lot of money to buy things with, and you want it to last, right? They're going to want to deny themselves pleasures, and they're going to want to seek out wealth as much as they can and gain money as much as you can. Try not to spend it, and save it, so that one day you can become one of these people like a Rockefeller or a Carnegie or what have you, because that's what the whole sense of being is, and that's what these parents that grow up and that have kids in this era try to pass along to their kids. And of course, sometimes it works out really well, and other times not so much. But very different ways of looking at the world around them. Now, the wealthy capitalists, manufacturers, merchants, landowners, executives, professionals, and their families made up roughly 1% to 2% of the overall population of the United States. And it's odd that 1% to 2% of the population should control so much of the wealth, but they did. They controlled a ton of it. Roughly 75% of the wealth was held by these guys that were not really a large part of the population. These were people who owned most of the nation's resources, and as such, they expected to make many of its key decisions because they owned those resources, because massive industries had been built off of those resources like steel and railroads and coal and oil and all that sort of stuff. They expected to be the movers and shakers. They expected to be the ones asked when major decisions come up and be the one making those decisions, because it would benefit their company, obviously, right? Their ranks included the nation's roughly 4,000 millionaires, with such famous names as Vanderbilt, Whitney, Carnegie, Harriman, and Morgan. Their most famous member, John D. Rockefeller, had amassed a fortune of just over $1 billion by 1913. He will become fabulously wealthy in first kerosene and then oil. And of course, we all know his Standard Oil, and we'll get into why he called it Standard Oil. But huge corporation, and it took great advantage of the people that worked there. But also, it did create a huge empire for himself. Some of the pieces parts of Standard Oil, if we think about it, two major pieces parts, Exxon and Mobil, are things we still have today. I think now they call them Elan or something like that, but they're still out there today. Other pieces too. He was a monopoly for so he owned 95% of the oil production in the United States. So this is the guy who ran pretty much everything. Now, interestingly enough, in a nation of immigrants, the majority of the upper 10 came from English stock, with families long established in America. These guys have been here since the time of the American Revolution or shortly thereafter. In a largely Protestant land, these upper 10% tended to belong to the more fashionable denominations, such as the Presbyterian, Episcopalian, and Congregational denominations. While fewer than 10% of the U.S. population had graduated from high school, many of the upper 10% had gone to college or professional school in some way, shape, or form. And so they had a leg up on the majority of the U.S. population during this period of time. Above all, they held a fundamental understanding about the nature of the individual and the necessity of individual freedom. Likewise, they attributed the hardships of the poor not to unfair economic systems that might hold them down or prevent their rise from poverty, but individual shortcomings. It wasn't the system's fault. It was the individual's fault. If the individual couldn't pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, so to speak, and bring themselves out of poverty on their own, how did you expect the system to do it? The system wasn't what held you down. It was your own personal shortcomings. Now, whatever you may think on that, this is their thought process during that period of time. And it flows perfectly with what most of the guys who owned big businesses such as Carnegie, Rockefeller, Edison, and others really thought about the people that were not famous last name guys like that. So that's an interesting difference between the upper 10% and everybody else. As for those who fell outside of the upper 10%, life was incredibly different. It was very different from what they had known. The majority of these guys were immigrants who had come to America seeking a better life. They wanted better for themselves, and so they come here. For many of them, the rags to riches rise to prominence would be elusive. It would be something that they would strive for most of their lives, and many of them would never really get there. Still, they came, and they endured some of the worst times in American history, whether they were man, woman, or child, because any of them could go to work. And especially in an immigrant household, when you come here with nothing, you have to have some sort of way to get to making money. And so you employ mom, dad, and any of the kids that are of working age, because all you had to have to send somebody to work was a note saying, hey, this kid is a good worker. And if your kid is anything like my kid, they have a really short attention span. And so I don't know how well that's going to work out in a factory, sitting in a machine all day doing the same thing over and over again, or we're on a production line, things like that. Short attention spans might not work out well, which is probably why we have that high rate of accidents and whatnot in the U.S. by 1913. Who knows? Now, between 1886 and 1915, 25 million immigrants will come to the United States. Most of them came from Italy and Southeastern Europe, but they also came from Scandinavia, Russia, Poland, Germany, Ireland, England, France. They came from all over, really, to get here. By 1910, 15% of the country's total population was foreign born. They, in other words, come from somewhere else. Many of these new Americans clung to their own languages, their own customs, their own cuisines. They gravitated toward communities that were like-minded, and of course populated by people from their own country. So they tended to stick with their own, despite the guidebook given to them when they got off at such places like Ellis Island and others that said, leave your old ways behind and take up the American cause, and you might experience a hard time, but eventually you'll overcome that and you can become something. If you just can overcome that and struggle through that. They really didn't listen to that, the whole leaving their history and their culture behind. They held on to that a lot. So there's that. Now, the presence of so many immigrants in such a short period of time caused alarm among many native-born Americans. I'm not talking about native, American groups like Indians. I'm talking about native-born Americans, people who were born here in the United States. They were considered native-born. And so the presence of so many immigrants in such a short period of time caused a great deal of concern among the native population because they were worried about their customs and their culture intermingling with the Native American culture, and how's that going to work? And they didn't want their kids to be influenced by that sort of thing. And of course, they brought Catholicism with them. They brought all kinds of different ways of thinking and doing things with them. And so that caused a great deal of concern among many native-born Americans about what the future of their country was going to look like. And not only that, but their family, also their kids. So they have worries right now with all these immigrants. Now, 80% of the immigrant wave settled in northern cities. By the turn of the century, more than a third of Chicago's populace was foreign-born. And there were more Irish in New York City than there were in Ireland. By 1900, 30 million Americans lived in cities, about a third of all U.S. residents. The number of cities larger than 100,000 also tended to increase with the influx of immigrants. So when you get from, it goes from 9 in 1860 to roughly 50 cities larger than 100,000 by 1910. So you've got a nice 50-year span in there where you're really enlarging the size of cities, and that contributes to the growth of cities. That's where most of these guys are going to end up. Some of them will go to farmland and whatnot, but the majority of these guys will end up in cities, and that will have a huge effect not only on this industrial revolution that we're having, but also on this population explosion that's going on in the United States. Now, working class, when you look at working class families, I think what's really interesting is just the sheer number of kids that are able to turn out. Working class immigrant women had 45% more children than native born women. They had more kids. They just had more kids. You're starting off in a new area. You gotta, sometimes, especially if you're living on farms or if you're trying to, establish a family, that's, one way to do it, having lots of kids. The death rate among those kids, though, is also astounding because it's incredibly high. Not only are you having tons of kids, lots of them are dying at birth or soon thereafter. For example, Italian mothers averaged 11 children. Polish mothers averaged 8 children. By 1900, 1 out of 3 Polish and Italian mothers had seen at least one of their children die before their first birthday. And through no fault of their own, but it's, still, that's a lot. And still they continued having kids in spite of all the trouble and turmoil of losing children. They still continued to have them. Now, why is that significant? What's the significance of immigration? Well, the significance of immigration is that as ethnicity develops in the late 19th century, class divisions were increasingly difficult to isolate from cultural distinctions. Most of the immigrant wave became members of the working class, which is what we've been talking about, right? By 1900, 75% of the manufacturing workers in the United States were immigrants or the children of immigrants. Hence, even though they came to a land laden with opportunity for upward mobility, many of them did not find the American dream, that whole rags to riches idea that they came here searching for. They found themselves employed in a job that you worked basically 12 hours a day, perhaps longer, to meet some sort of quota, and then you went on your way. And it didn't matter if you were a man, woman, or child. You all worked. So those conditions apply to pretty much everybody. Now, that idea of the American dream being so elusive, that's going to cause problems, because people from Ireland and France and England, places like that, Scandinavia, whatnot, that's one group of people. The ones that we really didn't care for all that much, the Chinese, oddly enough. We didn't care for Chinese immigrants. We called them the yellow peril. And part of the reason, the biggest part of the reason we didn't like them is that they were seen as a competitive labor threat. They would often be able to do the same job as a native-born American male for way less money, which is why the railroads enjoyed employing them to a great degree, because they would do things oftentimes that their native-born American counterparts would not. And they would do it for cheap, which, if you're trying to maximize profits, if you're a business owner, you're trying to maximize profits and output, hey, get them as cheap as you can. These guys came cheap, but we don't like them. Competitive labor threat. Now, as such, anti-Chinese riots broke out in San Francisco in 1877. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited all Chinese immigration for 10 years. The ban on Chinese immigration was later extended to last indefinitely and would not be repealed until 1943, in the midst of the Second World War. So this thing is going to be around for quite some time. The law banning Chinese immigration, this Chinese Exclusion Act, also banned criminals, the mentally ill or retarded, their words, not mine, and those likely to end up as public charity cases. Wow. We didn't really care for anybody during this period of time if they weren't like us. That's troubling. We'll get to more about that later. Now, not only did we not care for immigrants in many ways, but we also did not care for dealing with children and child labor. Child labor, though, is a huge issue during this period of time. Children were also made to work long hours for very low wages in coal mines and factories, mills, whatnot. Oftentimes, they worked in places with no ventilation and with little, if nothing, in the way of safety devices. We talked about it before. We had a huge accident rate, an incredibly high accident rate by 1913 because of things like this. Children weren't the only ones affected, though. Women were also at risk. And there's no better example of the real risk of working in one of these Gilded Age industries than the Triangle Shirtwaist disaster, which is a huge disaster. In fact, it's the largest disaster in U.S. history up to 9/11. So let's end on that one. Let's talk about that. Triangle Shirtwaist. What is a triangle shirtwaist? Sounds weird, right? Triangle shirtwaist is the waist of a shirt that forms a triangle. It's basically, it makes a little triangle. That's why it's called a triangle shirtwaist. But the thing is, they're all the rage in fashion, in ladies' fashion, especially during that period of time. And so this place, Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, is cranking these things out. Just to beat 60. And they're using women, usually teenage women and immigrant women, to make these shirtwaists. Now, problems. 500 people, mostly immigrant teenage women, worked in the factory for 12 hours a day, earning roughly $6 to $10 per week. $6 to $10. Interestingly enough, because the owners of that factory didn't want women stealing scraps of material to make things out of, stuff like that. They blocked a lot of the entrances with barrels of oil, things like that. They'd never really had any sort of checkup on the fire escape mechanism. So the fire escapes had basically rusted, the bolts had rusted away from the outside of the building. And so they were kind of dangerous to be on at this point. They did have elevators, but not really a great deal there. On March 25th, 1911, a fire starts in a bin full of cotton strips. We don't know how it started. Some people say, oh, somebody threw a cigarette or a match or something into this bin full of cotton strips. Well, in a place that sews triangle shirtwaists out of cotton, it doesn't take long for a fire to get started, okay? Women tried to go down the fire escape, but it was too flimsy. It had rusted away from its moorings, and so they couldn't get down the fire escape. Elevators, the newly created Otis elevators, made 4 trips up and down to rescue trapped workers before being shut down themselves, because they couldn't be relied upon to get people up and down anymore. But 4 trips they made. So hey, that at least they're trying, right? Now, when the fire department finally arrives, the tallest ladder they had only went to the 7th floor. Now, this is an example, a perfect example of cities and their growth outpacing basic services like fire and police departments. The fire department had a tall enough ladder for what would be considered a pretty tall building at the time, but we're building skyscrapers now, and we're the innovations in terms of the growth of the city are becoming more and more every day, and they can't keep up with that. So their tallest ladders not nearly tall enough to even get to these people who are trapped on the top floor of the building with no way out. Always a good time. Now, the tallest ladder they have only goes to the 7th floor. The fire's on the 8th floor. Darn it. As a result, many women jumped to their death, while others burned alive by the fire or died of smoke inhalation. In all, the event lasted only 18 minutes. At the time, it is the largest workplace disaster in American history. 146 women will either burn to death, die of smoke inhalation, or jump to their death. 146. It will be the worst workplace disaster in New York City until 9/11. Now, at the trial, after all of this is over, factory owners largely escape culpability for the fire, but it does lead to the creation of the Life Safety Code. Now, the Life Safety Code is important because today the code provides for fire escapes. It provides for lighted emergency exits. You ever go to the movies and it says, please notice the exit signs at the front and rear of the building, and you look up and you can see an exit sign in front of you and there's one behind you, illuminated, all nice. That's the Life Safety Code at work. It's why doors open outward, why sprinkler systems are there to prevent such tragedies from happening again, so that if a fire does start, you can at least get out of the building or know where to go to get out of the building. These ladies were trapped, couldn't get out, and so that probably is the huge historical significance from the Triangle Shirtwaist disaster. While 146 women do die senselessly in this disaster, it does bring about a huge change in the way that we do business. Now, factory owners will largely escape culpability for the fire, and that is a sad shame. They should have been held responsible for that, but the Life Safety Code is something we still use today. So I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and come back next time for more.